The first whisper reached Florence Valehart before the music did, a soft hiss of silk and judgment that slid between harp strings and polite laughter, and it tightened around her throat with the familiarity of a noose, because in London, a woman could be forgiven nearly anything except a name the Ton had decided was convenient to hate. She stood at the threshold of Lady Brackenridge's charity musicale in a deep wine velvet gown that drank the candlelight and gave it back in dark, sumptuous sheen, pearl gloves fitted to her wrists, her hair arranged in modest curls that brushed her jaw, her reticule held with the careful composure of someone who had learned to make grace look effortless even when her palms were damp. A footman announced arrivals in the practiced sing-song of society, and Florence felt the room's temperature change the instant he reached her, Miss Florence Valehart, as if the syllables themselves carried contagion. Heads turned in unison, not with curiosity but with appetite. Fans lifted like shields and then lowered like blades. Somewhere near the pianoforte, a laugh caught and reformed into something sharper, and Florence's aunt's grip on her elbow tightened with the silent warning she had heard since girlhood. Be smaller, be quieter, be harmless, because London punishes what it cannot classify as obedient. Florence stepped forward anyway, one measured pace at a time, her smile a practiced curve, her chin lifted just enough to suggest she had every right to breathe the same air as the women who wished she would choke on it. The host approached with forced brightness, apologies already forming, but a matron, one of those ladies whose respectability was built not on virtue but on the ruin of others, tilted her head and spoke loudly enough to be considered accidental. A pity, she murmured, that certain associations insist on attending where true charity is meant to be displayed. The sentence did not need Florence's name again. It carried it. Florence felt heat surge into her face, then drain away, leaving a cold steadiness she had learned from years of swallowing insults without letting them show on her skin. She could almost hear her late mother's voice, gentle and weary, warning her that the Ton was a creature that fed best when it sensed fear. A few ladies looked away with performative discomfort, more watched with bright, expectant eyes. Someone whispered, "Valehart," as if it were a stain discovered on white muslin, and Florence's lungs tightened, her vision narrowing to the glittering floor and the merciless curve of smiles. She had nearly turned, nearly allowed herself the old mercy of retreat, when a presence shifted at her side, precise and unhurried, the way a door closes quietly but leaves no doubt it has been shut. Duke Edmund Calderwyn stepped forward as though he had been standing there all along and merely chosen the moment to become visible, tall in a dark evening coat that fit him with severe elegance, his expression composed to the point of austerity, his eyes the calm of winter water hiding depth and danger. London knew him as controlled, distant, untouchable. It knew him as a man who did not spend himself on sentiment, who did not offer smiles he could not defend. He did not glance at the matron. He did not acknowledge the whispering circle. He looked only at Florence, as if the room had blurred into irrelevance, and she alone remained in focus, and he offered his hand with quiet ceremony. "Miss Valehart," he said, voice even, neither soft enough to be private nor loud enough to be spectacle, "you will do me the honor." It was not a question dressed as a compliment. It was a claim of respect made in the open. Florence's heartbeat stumbled. Her first instinct was disbelief, some trick of society, some cruel jest wearing a noble face. Yet Edmund's palm was steady, and when her gloved fingers met his, the contact felt like an anchor thrown into rough water. He turned slightly, positioning his body between her and the hungry attention behind her, and with the smallest shift of his shoulders, he made space around her, as if protection were a matter of simple geometry. Then, as the musicians faltered and hurried to recover, he guided Florence forward into the brightest part of the room, not as a scandal to be endured, but as a lady to be escorted, his composure daring anyone to suggest otherwise, and in the stunned silence that followed, Florence realized something terrifying and unprecedented. The Duke was not merely refusing to be ashamed of her name, he was wearing it, right there in the light, as if it belonged. Florence let the Duke draw her out of the glittering salon into a corridor lined with mirrors and marble, the music behind them recovering into cheerful obedience while whispers prowled at the threshold. Her deep wine velvet caught candlelight and seemed to invite judgment. She could feel eyes following the curve of her shoulders as if disgrace were a visible thread. Edmund halted by a curtained window and faced her with a composure that made the corridor feel private. "I have been accused of rudeness," he said, voice even, "for refusing to pretend I cannot hear what is spoken." His eyes held hers, direct without familiarity. Tell me, Miss Valehart, what do they believe your name signifies? Florence's throat tightened. They believe it signifies disgrace, she said carefully, and that disgrace spreads. And what do you believe it signifies? The question landed like a hand at her back, urging her upright. It signifies my father's stubborn honor, she whispered, and my mother's grief, and my own endless caution. From the corridor's mouth, two ladies paused, pretending to admire a marble bust while listening. Edmund's jaw tightened, not at her, but at the room. He shifted half a step, placing his shoulder between Florence and the watchers so protection became mere etiquette. London confuses repetition with truth, he said. It does so because thinking requires courage. Florence managed a brittle smile. You should not involve yourself, she murmured, the old caution rising. My name is a liability. A name is only a banner when someone chooses to carry it, Edmund replied, quiet and absolute. And I am weary of names being used as weapons by people too frightened to wield anything else. He studied her, as if weighing not scandal, but character. If you remain tonight, they will make sport of you. If you leave, they will claim you fled. Neither choice is kind. Florence's fingers tightened around her reticule. Then there is no safe choice. There is, Edmund said. There is the choice to be heard. Come to Calderwyn House tomorrow at 4. My carriage will call, and the crest on its door will tell London I meant it. He escorted her back to the salon's threshold, bowed with exact courtesy, and returned alone to the crowd, as if he would not purchase her compliance with touch. Florence departed soon after, her aunt fastening a black velvet cloak over her wine velvet gown, as if fabric could ward off malice. In the carriage he watched lamplight slide across wet pavement and tried to understand what had happened. A duke had spoken her name without flinching, and then asked what she believed it meant. At home she changed into a pale blue wrapper, dismissed her maid, and sat by the dark window until her fear quieted into something perilously close to hope, then reached for paper and ink. Morning arrived with the brisk efficiency of London season, and with it the papers, folded like polite knives. Florence read the gossip column before her aunt could snatch it away, because dread is always quickest in the blood. The writer was careful, offering no direct accusation, only insinuation, yet he revived the Valehart disgrace with the relish of a man who profits from smoke. He spoke of a lamentable business from years past, of a ledger that vanished at a convenient hour, of a trial that proved more about fashionable appetite than justice. He placed her father's name beside the words reckless, dishonest, and ruined, and then, with a genteel shrug in ink, suggested that the daughter should know her place. Florence sat in her pale apricot morning gown, the teacup cooling in her hands, and felt the old lesson press in, endure quietly, or be punished loudly. Her aunt declared that no one would call upon them today, that their own cards would be returned unanswered, and that Florence must not be seen in any drawing-room where her surname might curdle the air. Before noon, a footman in Calderwyn livery appeared with a silver tray, as if the Duke's household had decided to contradict every rule Florence had been raised to obey. The envelope bore Edmund's seal, clean wax, the crest pressed with unflinching authority, and her aunt went rigid, demanding what right he had to intrude upon their peace. Florence took the letter anyway, because she was tired of living as if permission were oxygen. Edmund's handwriting was spare and precise. He requested her company at 4 o'clock for tea and conversation, promising that his aunt would be present and that no guest would be admitted without his express consent. He asked, with cold courtesy, whether she possessed any family correspondence from the time of the accusations, even a scrap that might name the missing ledger's last keeper. Her aunt insisted the only proper reply was refusal, but Florence heard the paper's cruelty echoing in her bones and understood that silence had never protected her. In the mirror above the mantel she saw a woman trying to look unafraid, and she wondered how often courage begins as mere posture. She tied a deep green ribbon to her bonnet, refusing any funeral shades. Outside, wheels rattled on wet cobbles, and every sound seemed to ask whether she meant to live as a shadow or as herself. If the Duke withdrew his hand, she would fall, but if she never reached again, she would stay fallen forever. She rose, went to her small desk, and wrote acceptance in a steady hand that surprised her, sealing it with plain wax and a single breath of courage. When the footman carried her reply away, Florence watched the door close and realized she had chosen not safety, but the first step toward truth. Calderwyn House received Florence Valehart with the hush of disciplined wealth, the sort that did not announce itself with excess, but with certainty. She arrived in a cream day dress trimmed with forest green ribbons, her gloves immaculate, her shoulders squared against the instinct to apologize for occupying space. The footman admitted her at once, and she was shown into a morning room washed in pale winter light, where polished wood and restrained florals suggested order rather than indulgence. Duke Edmund Calderwyn rose as she entered, his greeting exact, his bow neither warm nor distant, and for a fleeting moment Florence felt the unnerving relief of being treated as expected rather than endured. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess Honoria Calderwyn, sat near the window with her knitting, eyes sharp and observant, the sort of woman who missed nothing and forgave even less. Tea was poured. Polite phrases were exchanged. Then Edmund did something Florence had not anticipated. He set rules aloud. No callers would be admitted without his approval. No servants would repeat what they overheard. No guest would presume familiarity with Florence's history. The boundaries fell into place like stones in a wall, and Florence felt herself breathe more deeply than she had in years. When the Dowager inclined her head, Edmund turned to Florence and asked her, simply, to tell him what she knew of the accusations as she herself understood them. Not what the papers said, not what London enjoyed repeating. What she knew. Florence's fingers tightened around her teacup, the porcelain warm against her skin, and she chose her words with care born of long habit. She spoke of her father's meticulous accounts, of the ledger entrusted to him and then demanded, of his refusal to sign a false confession when powerful men required a scapegoat. She did not embellish. She did not beg. She spoke of her mother's slow decline beneath the weight of whispers, of the way grief had hollowed their household, until silence became survival. Edmund listened without interruption, his attention steady and unsettling in its intensity, as if he were weighing truth rather than judging performance. When she finished, he acknowledged the gaps without accusation. A ledger missing leaves questions, he said. Questions invite answers. He admitted he possessed access to certain offices and certain men who remembered more than they admitted in public, but he promised nothing beyond effort and discretion. Florence felt both steadied and frightened by his restraint. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous luxury. The Dowager observed her closely, asking a single question about Florence's expectations. Florence answered with quiet honesty. She expected nothing but the chance to live without being hunted by rumor. Silence followed, not unkind, but assessing. Edmund concluded the visit with formal courtesy and an offer to continue the conversation, should Florence wish it. As she departed, Florence realized the house had not swallowed her name. It had held it carefully, as if testing whether it deserved protection. The second visit to Calderwyn House carried a different weight, as if the walls themselves had adjusted their expectations. Florence arrived in a soft dove rose walking dress with a cream spencer, her bonnet tied beneath her chin with deliberate neatness, every detail chosen to signal composure rather than plea. The Dowager Duchess Honoria Calderwyn received her in the same morning room, but the knitting was set aside this time, and Florence understood at once that courtesy had given way to examination. Edmund excused himself under the pretext of correspondence, a calculated absence that left Florence alone with a woman whose influence could open doors or quietly seal them forever. Honoria's questions were elegant and exact. She asked whether Florence understood the cost of being noticed by a duke who did not offer notice lightly, whether Florence believed reputation could be rebuilt without damaging others, whether gratitude might be mistaken for ambition. Each inquiry was phrased as concern, yet Florence felt the blade beneath the silk. Years ago she would have apologized for breathing, would have folded herself smaller to escape notice, but something in her had shifted since the musicale, since Edmund's hand had steadied hers in full view of London. She answered without defensiveness, her voice calm even as her pulse raced. She spoke of dignity as something owed, not requested. She spoke of truth as heavier than gossip, and therefore slower, but stronger. She did not deny fear, yet she refused to pretend fear disqualified her from respect. When Honoria suggested that some women mistook protection for promise, Florence met her gaze and replied that she mistook neither. She sought no rescue, only fairness, and if fairness proved impossible, she would endure as she always had, upright and unseen rather than grasping and humiliated. The words cost her. Her hands trembled faintly, and she knew the Dowager saw it, but she did not look away. Silence stretched, the sort that measures character rather than filling space. Edmund returned then, as if summoned by the precise moment when balance teetered. He took in the room with one glance, reading the tension as easily as ledgers, and positioned himself not in front of Florence but beside her, a choice that felt intentional. Honoria's gaze flicked between them. sharpening. She remarked that courage was admirable, but survival required more than courage. Edmund replied evenly that survival without integrity was merely delay. The air shifted. Florence felt it like a breath drawn after long restraint. When the visit ended, Honoria dismissed Florence with a nod that was neither approval nor rejection, and Florence understood that she had not won anything, but neither had she been dismissed. Outside, as Edmund escorted her to the door, he spoke quietly, thanking her for her honesty. Florence managed a small smile, exhaustion tugging at her composure. In the carriage home, she pressed her gloved hands together and realized she had stood her ground before power and not broken. Whatever followed, she would remember this moment, not as a victory, but as proof that her name could exist in the open without apology. Lady Octavia Strathmere arrived in Florence's life the way frost arrives on a clear morning, beautiful at first glance, destructive by afternoon. The encounter took place at a small morning visit, hosted by a mutual acquaintance, the sort of gathering meant to look harmless while sharpening claws. Florence wore a pale rose-sprigged muslin dress with a cream pelisse, the softness chosen deliberately, as if gentleness itself might disarm malice. Octavia greeted her with exquisite warmth, eyes bright, voice sweet, hands gloved in innocence, and for a moment Florence wondered whether she had misjudged her reputation. That illusion lasted precisely as long as it took for Octavia to tilt her head and speak of the past as if it were an anecdote rather than a wound. "I remember the Valehart business," she said lightly, turning her words into a fan that brushed several ears at once. "So tragic when one's elders fail us." The phrase was crafted to wound while remaining defensible, and the room responded as London always did, with polite murmurs that fed on cruelty without admitting it. Florence felt the familiar pressure to disappear, to become so unobtrusive she could not be struck, yet she held herself still, breathing through the surge of heat that threatened to betray her. She answered with measured courtesy, correcting nothing, denying nothing, refusing to play the role Octavia had written for her. The silence that followed was brittle. Then Duke Edmund Calderwyn entered the room, his timing precise enough to feel intentional. He observed the circle with one sweep of his gaze and addressed Octavia with immaculate politeness, thanking her for her concern, before asking whether she found it useful to revisit matters already being examined elsewhere. The words were mild. The warning beneath them was not. Octavia's smile did not falter, but something in her eyes cooled, and Florence understood she had been marked. Edmund offered Florence his arm and removed her from the room without spectacle, as if leaving were the most natural thing in the world. Once beyond the crush, he did not ask whether she was all right. He stated that Lady Strathmere enjoyed influence and resented challenges to her comfort. "She prefers her victories quiet," he said, "and her enemies smaller than they truly are." Florence absorbed the assessment with a strange calm. Naming the danger made it manageable. Yet as they parted, she sensed the shift. Octavia's interest was not casual, and Edmund's attention had sharpened from courtesy into resolve. That afternoon, Florence returned home unsettled, her thoughts racing ahead of her composure. She changed into a soft blue afternoon gown, paced her small sitting room, and recognized the pattern she had lived within for years, gossip escalating into threat when left unanswered. This time, however, she was not alone. Edmund's intervention had drawn a line, and Octavia had noticed. Florence understood that the battle had acquired a face, and that face smiled beautifully. She also understood something else, equally unsettling. For the first time, she felt herself standing in the open, no longer pretending the cold could not reach her, and discovering that she could endure it without breaking. Edmund chose the museum exhibition with the same deliberation he brought to every engagement, selecting a setting where cruelty would have to disguise itself as intellect if it wished to breathe. Florence arrived beneath the high ceilings in a midnight blue silk gown, the fabric plain but exquisitely cut, her hair secured with a silver comb that caught the light when she turned her head. The choice felt bold after weeks of careful softness, yet she welcomed the steadiness it lent her spine. Scholars, patrons, and benefactors filled the rooms, their conversations weighted with learning rather than gossip, though Florence knew how easily learning could become a weapon in practiced hands. Edmund greeted acquaintances with controlled courtesy and drew Florence into discussion without preamble, asking her thoughts on a displayed manuscript as if her opinion were expected, not indulged. She answered carefully at first, then with growing confidence, and felt the room recalibrate around her voice. They moved slowly through the gallery, Edmund guiding without steering, attentive to where Florence's interest lingered and where her discomfort stirred. He positioned them near people whose approval traveled efficiently through society, allowing Florence to be seen speaking with ease rather than standing silent under scrutiny. The strategy was unmistakable, not defense, but exposure on her own terms. Florence felt the familiar tension of being observed. Yet it was different now, sharpened into alertness rather than fear. She caught Octavia Strathmere watching from across the room, her smile thin and assessing, and Florence's pulse quickened. Edmund noticed at once. Without comment, he adjusted their course so Octavia would have to approach openly or retreat. She chose retreat, though her gaze promised this was not the end. Later, as they paused near a window overlooking the street, Edmund spoke quietly. "You held yourself well," he said, not as praise but as fact. Florence exhaled, surprised by how much the simple acknowledgement steadied her. "I felt as though I was standing beneath a lantern," she admitted. "Visible. Visibility can be shaped," he replied. "Left unattended, it becomes spectacle. Directed, it becomes narrative." The words lodged in her mind. Narrative was something others had always written for her. The idea that it could be shaped by her felt both dangerous and liberating. As the afternoon waned, Florence found herself answering questions without apology, laughing once without flinching, and realizing that the room had stopped waiting for her to fail. When they departed, she felt exhaustion bloom beneath her composure, the cost of vigilance exacted in full. Edmund escorted her to the carriage and paused before stepping back. "There will be resistance," he said, measured, "and retaliation." Florence met his gaze, the midnight blue of her gown deepening in the fading light. "I know," she said, "but I am tired of being quiet." He inclined his head, acceptance clear. At home, Florence changed into a soft cream evening dress and sat by the window, replaying the day until its edges smoothed. She understood now that Edmund was not shielding her from London. He was teaching her how to stand within it, and in that knowledge lay a courage she had never been permitted to claim as her own. The library at Calderwyn House was quieter than the rest of the world, a place where sound softened itself out of respect for the weight of thought. Florence sat near the fire in a soft ivory evening gown, with a wine-colored ribbon tied beneath the bust, the glow warming her skin while her thoughts remained restless. Edmund stood at the mantel, one hand braced against the stone, listening without interruption as she gathered the courage she had been circling since the museum. It was easier, she realized, to face gossip than to offer truth that could not be taken back. She began carefully, explaining how her father had taught her to read accounts before she could dance, how precision had been his refuge, and how refusing to sign a lie had cost him everything. Her voice did not tremble, but the memories pressed close, sharp as glass beneath silk. She spoke of her mother's decline, not dramatically, only as a fact of slow erosion, of laughter thinning into habit and habit into silence, and how Florence had learned to measure every word, so grief would not be fed by strangers. Edmund listened with a stillness that felt like protection rather than distance. When she admitted that hope frightened her more than cruelty, because hope could be withdrawn, he did not rush to reassure her. He acknowledged the fear as reasonable, a response born of experience rather than weakness. Then, in return, he offered a fragment of himself, not confession but context. He spoke of watching alliances collapse over careless attachments, of learning young that affection was currency others spent without consent. He said he had trained himself to remain controlled because control denied the world leverage. Florence understood then that his restraint was not indifference. It was survival refined into principle. The fire shifted, settling into a steadier burn, and Florence felt the room tighten around the truth they were sharing. She confessed that she had survived by becoming smaller, by letting others define the limits of her presence, and that being seen now felt like standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. Edmund met her gaze without flinching. "You are not reckless," he said quietly. "You are careful because you have been punished for existing." The words struck deeper than comfort. They named her without diminishing her. Silence followed, heavy but not uncomfortable. Florence realized that nothing had been promised, and yet something irrevocable had occurred. She had spoken without being corrected, without being managed, without being reduced. Edmund had listened without attempting to fix what could not be fixed. When she rose to leave, he did not offer his arm, honoring propriety, but he did walk her to the door, his presence steady and unintrusive. In the corridor, Florence paused, the ivory of her gown pale against dark paneling, and understood that intimacy did not always announce itself with touch. Sometimes it arrived as recognition, quiet and exact, and once recognized, it could not be unseen. breakfast at Calderwyn House unfolded with deliberate calm, as if routine itself were a bulwark against uncertainty. Florence entered the morning room in a buttercream gown edged with blue embroidery, her hair arranged simply, her posture composed despite the restless night that clung to her thoughts. Edmund sat already at the table, reviewing correspondence with the same controlled focus he brought to everything, yet he rose at once when she appeared, setting aside the papers as if the order of the day had shifted. Tea was poured, bread was broken. Only when the servants withdrew did Edmund speak of the matter that had been circling them both like a held breath. "There are records that do not live in public offices," he said evenly. "Men who remember more than they admit. A ledger does not vanish without leaving impressions." Florence listened, heart quickening despite herself. He outlined his proposal with care, a discreet inquiry, quiet requests made through trusted intermediaries, no promises beyond diligence. He would not parade her grievance for sympathy. He would pursue facts where facts were hidden. Florence felt hope rise and forced herself to keep her voice steady when she asked the necessary questions. Who might resist? Who benefited from the Valehart disgrace remaining unresolved? What cost such an inquiry might exact? Edmund answered without evasion. Resistance would come from those who feared exposure. Benefit accrued to anyone who preferred a scapegoat to scrutiny. As for cost, he said simply that truth was rarely inexpensive. Florence surprised herself by insisting on participation. She would not be carried while others worked on her behalf. She asked to see any correspondence uncovered, to learn how evidence was weighed, to understand the process rather than wait for its outcome. Edmund studied her for a long moment, measuring resolve rather than daring, then inclined his head in acceptance. "Partnership," he said, as if naming a principle rather than an intimacy. The words settled between them with unexpected gravity. Later, in the library, Edmund showed her a narrow drawer of old files, explaining how dates written in text revealed haste or care, how signatures betrayed pressure or leisure. Florence absorbed the instruction with a focus that surprised even her, the years of vigilance sharpening into purpose. When she noticed a faint tremor in her hands, she pressed them flat on the desk and continued. Edmund did not remark upon it. He adjusted the lamp instead, shifting light to clarity rather than exposure. As the morning wore on, Florence felt the shape of fear change. It did not vanish, but it organized itself, becoming something she could address rather than endure. She understood that inquiry would stir enemies who preferred silence, yet she also recognized that waiting had never spared her their attention. When they parted, Edmund returned to his papers and Florence to the window, watching the street with new eyes. For the first time, the future did not look like an ambush disguised as routine. It looked like work, dangerous, exacting, and necessary, and she found, to her own astonishment, that she was ready to begin. The garden fete unfolded beneath a sky too blue to be trusted, sunlight catching on polished boots and pale parasols, as if London itself were determined to look innocent. Florence arrived on Edmund's arm in soft lilac muslin, the gown light enough to move with the breeze, white gloves fitted cleanly to her wrists, and a pale green spencer fastened with deliberate neatness. She had chosen the colors with care, not grey, not apology, something gentle but unafraid. The lawns were crowded with promenading circles that pretended to admire roses while measuring reputations, and Florence felt the familiar prickle of attention skim her skin like a warning. Edmund guided their path with practiced ease, pausing where greetings were unavoidable and moving on before curiosity could sharpen into sport. He did not hover, he simply remained, his presence a constant geometry that made space around her. It was near a stand of winter bare roses that Lady Octavia Strathmere intercepted them, her smile bright as frost. She spoke as if confiding a kindness, remarking on Florence's bravery in appearing after all that unpleasantness, and then, with exquisite timing, added that some banners were raised only so they could be burned more efficiently. The phrase landed with precision, light enough to be dismissed as wit, sharp enough to cut. Florence felt the old instinct to fold inward surge, but anger rose faster this time, clean and cold. She met Octavia's gaze and answered evenly that banners were not raised by accident, and that those who feared them feared what they revealed. The surrounding laughter faltered, uncertain whether amusement was still permitted. Edmund arrived beside her at once, not with spectacle but with stillness that altered the air. He did not demand explanations. He did not scold. He placed Florence at his side and looked at Octavia with a courtesy so exact it left no room for misunderstanding. "We are discussing matters under review," he said mildly. "It would be imprudent to embroider them." The The warning was unmistakable. Octavia's smile tightened, her eyes calculating retreat without surrender. She inclined her head and withdrew, already planning another approach. But the damage had been done. Witnesses had seen Florence refuse humiliation without flinching. Witnesses had seen Edmund refuse to play along. As they continued through the fete, Florence's heart beat hard against the bodice of her lilac gown, not from fear alone but from the unfamiliar sensation of standing her ground in daylight. Edmund spoke quietly, advising caution without reproach, acknowledging her composure without praise. The restraint steadied her more than effusive reassurance could have. When a matron offered a stiff compliment on Florence's dress, Florence returned it with calm politeness and did not look away. The small victory felt enormous. Later, as the sun dipped and the crowd thinned, Edmund escorted her to the carriage. "This will not end it," he said, measured. Florence nodded, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice when she replied, "I know." The gardens receded behind them, bright and treacherous, and Florence realized the line had been crossed. The game had shifted from whispers to intention, and Edmund had seen it as clearly as she had. This time, she was not shrinking from the knowledge. She was bracing herself for what came next. The dinner Edmund selected was not fashionable in the obvious sense, which made it more dangerous than any glittering rout. It was hosted by a political matron whose table was known for gathering people who preferred influence to applause, and Florence understood at once that nothing said there would be forgotten. She arrived in a rich plum silk gown with subtle jet beading at the hem and a black velvet ribbon at her throat, the color deep enough to command attention without pleading for it. Edmund placed her beside him as though the arrangement required no justification, and the ripple of awareness around the table was immediate, contained, and sharp. Conversation resumed with studied normalcy, each guest deciding how much risk was acceptable before dessert. The first remark came wrapped in humor, a gentleman observing that reputations were fragile things, easily cracked by poor associations. Florence felt the words skim her like thrown stones, familiar and intended. Before she could respond, Edmund lifted his glass with unhurried precision. He did not look at the speaker. He addressed the table. He spoke of integrity as a practice rather than a virtue, of the damage done when people allowed rumor to substitute for inquiry, and of the peculiar cruelty that flourished when manners excused it. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but the effect was unmistakable. Silence followed, thick and instructive. Florence felt heat behind her eyes, not from shame but from the knowledge that he was risking disapproval he did not need to risk. The meal continued with care. Questions turned toward Florence, cautious and probing, and she answered without defensiveness, offering measured responses that neither invited pity nor provoked confrontation. She spoke of books she admired, of causes she supported quietly, of her preference for clarity over drama. A few faces softened, others hardened. Edmund did not rescue her from attention. He let her carry it herself, and the respect in that choice steadied her more than his presence alone. When Octavia Strathmere appeared at the far end of the table, her arrival was a disruption masked as charm. She offered a smile to Florence that did not reach her eyes, then redirected the talk towards safer ground, as if retreat were strategy rather than concession. When the evening ended, Edmund offered his arm without ceremony and escorted Florence through the hall as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Outside, the night air was cool, the street lamps blurred by mist. In the carriage, Florence sat back, the plum silk pooling around her knees, and felt the delayed tremor of release. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. "You risked more than I did." Edmund's gaze remained forward. "Risk is relative," he replied. "I will not purchase comfort with another person's silence." The words settled between them, not as romance, but as alignment. Florence understood then that whatever lay ahead would not be negotiated in half measures. He had made his position clear, and London had heard him. The letter arrived the following morning by a route too careful to be accidental, slipped into Florence's hand by a maid who looked frightened to be carrying it. The paper was plain, the seal unremarkable, the handwriting deliberately nondescript, and yet Florence felt its intent before she broke it open, as if threat carried a temperature of its own. She stood by the small escritoire in her sitting room, dressed in a pale lavender morning gown with a white fichu, and read the message once, then again, because disbelief is a habit learned early. "Leave London within the week," it instructed, "or be ruined properly this time." There was no flourish, no signature, only the confidence of someone accustomed to obedience. Florence's aunt reacted with panic, pacing and wringing her hands, insisting that discretion demanded immediate retreat, that Florence had already tempted fate too often. Florence felt fear bloom, sharp and familiar, but beneath it stirred something else, a refusal that surprised her with its strength. She had obeyed threats before. Obedience had never saved her. Edmund was summoned at once. He read the letter with a stillness that suggested calculation rather than shock, his jaw tightening not in anger but resolve. He did not dismiss the threat as bluster. He did not offer empty comfort. He stated facts. The warning meant Florence was no longer merely inconvenient. She was obstructive. Someone had decided pressure was necessary. His solution followed immediately. Florence would remain under Calderwyn protection until they knew who was applying that pressure. The arrangement would be framed as propriety rather than alarm. Her temporary residence at Calderwyn House under the Dowager's supervision, a measure that allowed safety without scandal. Florence bristled at first, shame rising at the idea of needing shelter, but Edmund addressed her resistance with calm respect. Strategy was not dependence, he said. It was choice made with eyes open. Florence weighed the truth of it while her aunt protested in the background. To stay meant scrutiny, whispers sharpened by proximity to power. To go meant surrender. She chose to stay. The decision steadied her even as it frightened her, because it required her to trust not only Edmund's influence but her own judgment. That afternoon she packed a modest trunk, choosing practicality over display, refusing any garment that suggested mourning or retreat. When she arrived at Calderwyn House, she wore a soft almond traveling dress beneath a navy pelisse, her bonnet tied firmly, her expression composed. The Dowager received her with formality that masked concern, issuing rules that emphasized propriety and discretion in equal measure. As evening settled, Florence stood in the guest chamber and listened to the house quiet around her, aware that the world outside had not softened, only sharpened its tools. Edmund passed the doorway once, pausing to ensure she had what she required, his courtesy exact and unintrusive. Alone at last, Florence removed her gloves and looked at her bare hands, steady despite everything. She understood the threshold she had crossed. The threat had forced her inward, into a space where retreat was no longer an option. Whatever came next would be faced from within the walls of power, not from the margins where she had learned to hide. Living beneath the same roof altered time itself, compressing days into moments and stretching silences until they felt deliberate. Florence appeared at breakfast on her first morning at Calderwyn House, in a soft apricot gown with white lace at the cuffs, her hair arranged plainly, her composure a careful construction she refused to let crack. The Dowager presided with measured authority, ensuring propriety ruled the table, yet even under scrutiny, Florence sensed the peculiar safety of rules enforced by someone who meant to keep them. Edmund arrived punctually, greeted Florence with courteous neutrality, and took his place opposite her as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, though she felt his awareness like a held breath across polished wood. The household settled into a disciplined rhythm that steadied her nerves. Morning hours belonged to reading and correspondence, afternoons to walks through the square or quiet music, evenings to restrained company or solitude. Florence learned the pattern of Edmund's days without intending to. The hour he reviewed estate accounts, the interval when messengers arrived, the precise calm with which he closed doors. She found comfort in predictability and danger, in how easily comfort grew. At times she caught his gaze lingering a fraction too long, the restraint in him taut as wire, and she wondered whether he felt the same awareness, threading the corridors between them. In the library one afternoon, Florence requested to assist with copying letters, offering usefulness as a shield against idleness. Edmund agreed without hesitation, setting her to work beside him at a broad desk, the space formal yet intimate. She wore a butter-yellow afternoon gown with simple pearl buttons, sleeves rolled with permission rather than rebellion, and concentrated on ink and paper while the quiet thickened. Their hands did not touch, yet the proximity was unmistakable. He asked her opinion on a passage, and when she answered, he listened as if accuracy mattered more than elegance. The respect in that attention warmed her more than flattery ever could. The Dowager observed these small exchanges with a watchful eye, allowing nothing improper, preventing everything reckless. Florence was grateful for the boundaries, even as they sharpened desire into something precise and contained. At dinner, Edmund spoke little, yet his restraint felt protective rather than distant, and Florence realized he was guarding not only her reputation but his own control. She wondered what it cost him to maintain it. That evening, Florence retired early in a pale cream nightdress, sitting by the window with a book she did not read, listening to the city soften beyond the glass. She acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. This nearness was altering her, coaxing courage from habit and longing from caution. She feared wanting what could not be safely wanted, feared the moment when propriety would no longer be sufficient armor. And yet, as footsteps passed her door and paused briefly before moving on, Florence felt steadier than she had in years. She was not being hidden. She was being held, by rules, by respect, by a man who understood restraint as a form of care. The past refused to remain buried. No matter how carefully London pretended it had never existed. News arrived one afternoon folded into Edmund's correspondence, carried by a steward whose expression betrayed nothing but urgency. Florence was in the small sitting room wearing a pale sage walking dress with a cream pelisse, trimming loose threads from her gloves as a way of keeping her hands occupied, when Edmund entered and closed the door with deliberate care. He did not soften his voice, yet he did not alarm her either. A name had surfaced, he said, one with enough polish to pass unquestioned through respectable rooms: Viscount Rotherby. The missing Valehart ledger, long presumed destroyed, may have passed through Rotherby's possession years earlier, retained not for profit, but for leverage. Florence felt the room tilt, the safety of Calderwyn House momentarily thinning, because the enemy had shifted from rumor to flesh. Edmund laid out what little they knew with exact precision. Rotherby moved easily among those who valued discretion above truth, and he was often seen in Lady Octavia Strathmere's company. The connection was no accident. Florence listened, fear coiling low in her stomach, yet something steadier overrode it. Names could be faced, shapes could be confronted. She asked questions Edmund did not expect, about access, about witnesses, about what resistance would look like if met politely. He answered each without condescension, recognizing that she was no longer content to be shielded from the mechanics of her own fate. When she asked whether Rotherby would strike back, Edmund did not lie. Men who traded in silence preferred pressure to confrontation, he said. Threats would likely come disguised as courtesy. Florence considered this, then surprised them both by insisting she be kept informed of every step. She would not sit in safe rooms while others decided which truths were fit to survive. Edmund studied her, measuring resolve against risk, then nodded once. Agreement was given not as indulgence, but as respect. The house shifted subtly after that, as if acknowledging her promotion from guest to participant. Letters were read aloud in her presence. Decisions were explained, not announced. Florence felt the unfamiliar weight of agency settle onto her shoulders, heavy but bracing. That evening, as dusk bled into the corridors, Florence changed into a soft sky blue gown and joined Edmund for tea. Conversation moved easily, but beneath it ran awareness sharpened by danger. Florence recognized that Rotherby's emergence meant retaliation was no longer hypothetical. She also recognized something more personal and more frightening. Edmund was involving her because he trusted her, and trust carried its own risks. As she retired later, candlelight flickering across familiar walls, Florence understood that the investigation had crossed a threshold. The past was no longer whispering from a distance. It had stepped forward, well-dressed and smiling, and it expected obedience. This time, Florence intended to disappoint it. Sleep abandoned Florence entirely that night, leaving her thoughts to pace the corridors long after the house had settled into guarded quiet. Near midnight she rose, wrapped a deep emerald shawl around her shoulders over a white chemise gown, and slipped from her chamber with the careful steps of someone practiced in moving without sound. The library drew her, as it always did, its darkened shelves promising order where her mind found none. She told herself she wanted only the comfort of books, yet when she reached the desk, her gaze strayed to the cabinet Edmund rarely opened, its lock gleaming faintly in the fire's dying glow. Waiting had never protected her. Waiting had only prolonged uncertainty. With a steadying breath, she reached for the key kept in a shallow drawer nearby, her fingers trembling despite her resolve. The door opened behind her before the lock could turn. Florence froze, heart hammering, shame and defiance colliding in her chest. Edmund stood in the doorway, coat discarded, sleeves rolled, his expression alert rather than startled, as if he too had been pacing wakefulness into the small hours. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand explanations. He asked, quietly, what she sought. Florence swallowed and answered with a truth that surprised her by its simplicity. She could not bear to remain passive while others handled the evidence of her life. She wanted to understand it, to touch it, to know how truth hid itself in ink and omission. For a moment, Edmund studied her as if weighing a blade in his hand, testing its balance. Then he crossed the room and unlocked the cabinet himself. Papers emerged in careful stacks, the smell of old ink rising like memory. Edmund explained how to read dates written in text rather than numbers, how signatures bent under pressure, how margins told stories official lines would not. Florence listened with fierce attention, the emerald of her shawl pooling at her elbows as she leaned closer, the fire casting amber light across the page. Their hands brushed once, briefly, over a ledger's corner, and both went still, awareness flaring and then subsiding into restraint. Edmund stepped back first, giving space without withdrawing trust. As they worked, Florence felt something settle into place, a sense of competence that steadied her breath and quieted fear. She asked questions. Edmund answered. He corrected gently, praised rarely, and never took the papers from her hands. When she faltered, he adjusted the lamp, shifting light to clarity rather than exposure. The night thinned around them, silence heavy but companionable, and Florence realized she was no longer trespassing in his world. She had been invited into it. At last Edmund gathered the documents and returned them to their place. He did not scold her for wandering the house or for daring the lock. He said only that courage was most dangerous when it masqueraded as impatience, and that he would rather she ask than steel herself into risk alone. Florence nodded, accepting the rebuke because it came paired with respect. As she turned toward the door, the emerald shawl catching the light, she understood that something irrevocable had changed. She was not being protected from truth. She was being taught to hold it. The Dowager Duchess Honoria Calderwyn summoned Edmund the following morning with a precision that allowed no pretense of coincidence. Florence, crossing the corridor in a pale sage walking dress with a cream pelisse, heard just enough through the half-closed door to slow her steps, not from curiosity but from instinct. Honoria's voice was calm, her words chosen with surgical care, and yet the weight behind them pressed hard. She spoke of consequence rather than sentiment, of doors that could close without noise, of alliances that could cool in ways no one would publicly acknowledge. She spoke of Florence's name as a spark near dry straw, and of Edmund's duty to ensure that Calderwyn did not burn for another family's sins. Florence's pulse thudded, old reflexes urging retreat, but she stayed where she was, because running had never changed the outcome. Edmund did not raise his voice. He did not soften his reply. He told his aunt that a name should be a shelter, not a whip, and that if Calderwyn meant anything, it must stand for protection rather than convenience. He acknowledged the risks she outlined and accepted them without negotiation, stating plainly that cowardice dressed as prudence was still cowardice. The words landed with the finality of a decision long made. Honoria's silence followed, heavy and measuring, and Florence understood that the argument was not over, but it had shifted. Edmund was no longer asking permission. Florence moved away before she could be discovered listening, her breath shallow, her hands cold inside her gloves. When Edmund found her later in the morning room, she expected explanation or apology. He offered neither. Instead, he spoke to her with the same composed respect he had always shown, asking whether she wished to continue the inquiry, knowing it would provoke resistance not only from enemies, but from allies who preferred comfort. Florence answered without hesitation. She had lived beneath resistance her entire life. She would not turn back now that truth had shape. Edmund inclined his head, a gesture that felt less like approval and more like recognition. That afternoon, Florence changed into a soft sky blue gown and sat at the escritoire, copying correspondence for Edmund's solicitor, her script steady despite the undercurrent of danger. The dowager observed from across the room, her gaze sharp but no longer dismissive. Florence sensed that something in Honoria had shifted, not toward affection, but toward respect for resolve that did not bend. When Edmund joined them for tea, conversation remained formal, yet Florence felt the weight of alignment settle around her like armor. She was no longer a tolerated guest. She was a chosen cause. That night, alone in her chamber, Florence considered what she had overheard and what it meant. Edmund's loyalty was not a flourish of gallantry. It was a deliberate act that would cost him. The knowledge frightened her and steadied her in equal measure. For the first time, she understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to carry it openly, and that Edmund had chosen to carry hers alongside his own. Lady Octavia Strathmere's card party was announced as an intimate evening of diversion, which Florence understood to mean a carefully curated arena. Declining would be read as weakness. Attending would invite the blade. She chose attendance. When she entered the drawing room, She wore a ruby-red silk gown with a black lace shawl, the color unapologetic, the cut severe enough to signal resolve rather than allure. The room glittered with chandeliers and expectation. Octavia received her with delighted warmth, a smile perfected by years of practice, and guided her toward a table already ringed with attentive faces. Cards were dealt. Laughter fluttered. The trap closed quietly. Octavia began with reminiscence, her tone fond, her words arranged to bruise. She spoke of old trials, of how unfortunate it was when daughters inherited the consequences of fathers' choices, and she let the room believe she was offering sympathy. Florence felt the familiar heat rise, the reflex to soften, to deflect, to apologize for the discomfort her presence caused. She resisted it. She remembered the library at midnight, the ledgers, the discipline of ink and margin. When she spoke, her voice was calm and precise. She corrected a date without accusing anyone of error. She named a fact and allowed it to stand without ornament. The effect was immediate. Silence edged the laughter, eyes sharpened, recalibrating. Octavia pressed again, her smile tightening. Florence answered again, each reply measured, neither defensive nor pleading, and the rhythm of the room began to change. This was not a woman begging for mercy. This was a woman insisting on accuracy. Edmund watched from across the room, his presence contained, his restraint deliberate. He did not intervene. He did not rescue. He let Florence hold the floor she had claimed, and the gift of that trust steadied her more than his proximity ever could. When a gentleman attempted a jest at Florence's expense, she met it with a question so polite and pointed it demanded clarification. The jest collapsed under its own weight. At last Octavia's composure cracked, just enough to reveal calculation beneath charm. She withdrew from the table under the pretense of refreshment, leaving behind a room newly aware that cruelty required cooperation, and cooperation had not been granted. Florence felt the tremor of delayed reaction, relief, pride, exhaustion, arrive all at once. Edmund crossed the room then, offering his arm as if concluding an ordinary evening. "You were exact," he said quietly, not praise but recognition. Florence nodded, the ruby silk warm against her skin, and allowed herself one unguarded breath. In the carriage home, Florence stared out at the darkened streets and understood what she had done. She had answered malice without shrinking, and the world had adjusted to her stance. It did not mean safety. It meant visibility of a different kind. Edmund's silence beside her was thoughtful rather than distant, and she sensed that her courage had shifted something in him as well. The game had changed again, not because Octavia had retreated, but because Florence had refused the role written for her. The witness surfaced the next morning like a bruise pressed too hard to hide. Edmund's solicitor arrived with careful urgency, his hat still in hand, his voice lowered even within Calderwyn House's disciplined walls. There was a clerk, he said, a man who had served the court during the Valehart proceedings, old enough now to fear both memory and consequence. He had agreed to speak, but only if Miss Valehart came herself, and only in a place where he believed God might hear him before men did. A small riverside chapel was named, plain and forgotten, far from the salons where truth was twisted into entertainment. Florence listened in a soft dove-blue day gown, with a navy cloak folded over her arm, the color chosen for quiet resolve rather than concealment. Her first instinct was refusal. Privacy had always been where danger sharpened its teeth. Yet witnesses did not offer themselves twice, and she understood that fear, once indulged, would demand obedience. She said she would go. Edmund objected at once, not with authority but with concern that edged towards severity. Florence met it steadily. She would not be hidden while others risked themselves on her behalf. The past had been written without her voice. This time, she would speak where it mattered. The argument ended not in victory but in agreement, because Edmund insisted on accompanying her, and Florence, after a pause that cost her pride, admitted she wanted him there. The confession changed the air between them, not with drama but with honesty that could not be retrieved. They departed an hour later, the carriage moving through grey morning streets that smelled of damp stone and restraint. The chapel was small and cold, its stone worn smooth by knees and time. Florence stepped inside, the dove-blue gown pale against shadow, her breath misting faintly as candles guttered. The clerk arrived late, hunched and sweating despite the chill, his eyes darting toward the door with the practiced fear of a man long accustomed to being watched. He spoke in fragments at first, half answers and cautions, explaining that someone had already visited him with money and warning, that silence had been made profitable and dangerous in equal measure. Florence felt the old anger rise, not hot, but clean, at how easily truth was bought and buried. He began to name names then, his voice trembling, when footsteps sounded outside the chapel wall, close enough to scrape stone. The clerk went pale, words dying on his tongue. Edmund's hand tightened at Florence's elbow, not possessive, but bracing, and he guided her back a step as the shadow crossed the narrow window and passed on. No confrontation followed, only the certainty that they had been measured and found present. Edmund did not wait for proof. He ushered Florence out with controlled speed, leaving the clerk to slip away through a side door like a man fleeing his conscience. In the carriage, Florence's hands shook beneath her gloves. Edmund said nothing until the horses were moving, then spoke with quiet finality. The past was no longer content to whisper. It had begun to pursue. Florence leaned back, heart pounding, and understood that whatever came next would not be contained by manners alone. The hunt had turned real, and retreat was no longer an option. The carriage rolled away from the chapel with deceptive smoothness, wheels murmuring over damp stone as if nothing had been disturbed. Yet Florence felt the aftershock of danger vibrating through her bones. She sat rigid in her dove-blue gown beneath the navy cloak, fingers laced tightly in her lap, listening for pursuit in every echoing hoofbeat. Edmund faced forward, posture immaculate, his stillness more unnerving than anger would have been. Only when they reached a broader street did he speak, his voice low and controlled. The clerk would vanish for a time, he said, not by fear alone but by instruction. A frightened witness could still be preserved if moved with care. Florence nodded, absorbing the strategy while the image of that shadow at the chapel window replayed itself with merciless clarity. Someone had wanted them seen, someone had wanted them measured. They had gone scarcely another block when the carriage lurched, not violently, not yet, but with a wrongness Florence felt before she understood it. Edmund's hand lifted at once, signaling the driver to slow, and his gaze sharpened, assessing sound and sway with trained precision. The vehicle shuddered again. A grinding complaint from beneath that had no place in a well-kept carriage. Edmund ordered a halt. When the driver dismounted and crouched to inspect the wheel, the verdict came quickly and without drama. A bolt loosened, not enough to cause immediate catastrophe, enough to ensure it would come at speed. Sabotage dressed as accident. Florence closed her eyes for a single breath, anger cutting through fear like clean steel. This was no longer rumor or threat penned in neat ink. This was intent. Edmund moved with swift economy. He dismissed the driver to fetch assistance from a nearby mews, posted himself between Florence and the street without spectacle, and sent a messenger with instructions carried by trust rather than badge. Florence watched him, the precision of his choices anchoring her as surely as his presence. She felt guilt flare. This danger meant for her, absorbed by him, then burned it away. Guilt was a luxury for those who could afford retreat. She straightened her spine and met his gaze when he returned to the carriage door. "We will not proceed as planned," he said. "London has decided to press," Florence answered without hesitation. "Then we must deny it the satisfaction." Within the hour, arrangements were remade. An alternate carriage arrived. Routes were changed, messages dispatched. Florence was bundled into a dark plum traveling cloak over a pale cream dress, the colors practical, the choice decisive. Edmund ordered departure from the city without delay, framing the move as discretion to servants and necessity to allies. As the city thinned into winter fields, Florence watched lamplight recede and felt something harden into place inside her. Fear remained, but it had been joined by fury and purpose. They reached Calderwyn Grange at dusk, the estate quiet and guarded, its presence a promise of order amid chaos. Edmund dismounted first, offering his hand only when propriety permitted, and Florence took it with steady resolve. She understood now that the past was not content to be uncovered. It would resist, strike, and retreat behind manners if allowed. As she crossed the threshold, Florence accepted the truth she could no longer deny. This was no longer a battle for reputation alone. It was a contest for survival, and she intended to meet it standing. Calderwyn Grange received them with the quiet authority of stone that had never learned to panic. The drive curved through bare-limbed trees and iron gates before opening onto the house, its windows lit against the early dusk like steady eyes. Florence stepped down from the carriage in her dark plum traveling cloak over a pale cream dress, the cold air sharp on her cheeks, and felt the last tremor of the road drain from her limbs as the door closed behind them. Edmund issued instructions with calm efficiency. Guards doubled, Messengers rotated, routes varied, his voice measured, his decisions immediate. Nothing in his manner suggested fear, only resolve, and Florence found herself drawing strength from the certainty of it. Inside, the Grange unfolded in disciplined order. Fires were lit, tea was brought, a chamber prepared without fuss. Florence removed her cloak and gloves, noticing how steady her hands had become now that danger had named itself plainly. Edmund joined her in the smaller withdrawing room, the one with the long windows overlooking winter fields, and spoke with candor that cut through the day's restraint. London would be denied further access to her, he said, until they determined who had authorized the tampering. The inquiry would continue, but at a distance, through trusted intermediaries. He would not risk her again to prove a point. Florence listened, weighing the words not as a child being instructed, but as a partner assessing terms. She agreed to the withdrawal, on the condition that she be kept informed of every step, every message sent and received. Edmund accepted without hesitation. The agreement settled between them like a contract signed without ink. That night, Florence dined simply in a soft pearl grey, no, ivory, house gown, the colour chosen deliberately away from mourning, the cut practical. She ate little, but she listened as Edmund outlined contingencies, naming allies who could be relied upon and those who would need watching. When he mentioned Rotherby again, his tone cooled, and Florence recognized the dangerous focus beneath it. This was not a man startled into action. This was a man prepared to finish what had been begun. The realization frightened her and steadied her in equal measure. Later, alone in her chamber, Florence sat by the fire and allowed herself a moment to feel the day's cost. The chapel shadow, the loosened bolt, the knowledge that her life had been deemed acceptable collateral. She pressed her palms together until the ache anchored her, then let the feelings pass without indulging them. Survival, she had learned, required discipline. She changed into a pale blue nightdress, braided her hair, and stood at the window, looking out at fields silvered by moonlight. Somewhere beyond them lay London, bright and treacherous. Here, there was quiet and watchfulness, and a man who had chosen to place himself between her and the blade. When Edmund knocked to ensure she wanted nothing, she thanked him with a steadiness that surprised them both. He inclined his head and withdrew without intrusion. Florence lay awake a long while afterward, listening to the house settle, and understood that the Grange was not an escape. It was a line drawn. The contest had shifted ground, and with it, her own understanding of courage. She was no longer merely enduring what came. She was preparing to answer it. Morning at Calderwyn Grange arrived with a pale, deliberate light that seemed to rinse the night from the fields without haste. Florence rose early and dressed for the cold, choosing a pale peach walking dress with a brown wool pelisse, the practical warmth a comfort against the sharp air that swept the lawns. The estate breathed in measured rhythms, boots on gravel, doors opened and closed with purpose, the distant lowing of cattle, and in that order she found a steadiness she had not known she could claim. Edmund met her at the door for a circuit of the grounds, his stride unhurried, his attention alert, and for a time they walked without speaking, the frost whitening the edges of fallen leaves, as if the land itself were practicing restraint. They spoke at last of neutral things, weather, tenants, the river's temper in winter, until Florence asked about the accounts she had glimpsed in London, the ledgers that mapped obligation and care as cleanly as ink could manage. Edmund considered, then invited her to the estate office after breakfast, not as diversion but as work. There, amid shelves of bound volumes, he showed her how the Grange functioned. Rents adjusted with mercy when storms ruined crops, repairs authorized before neglect turned costly, the quiet calculus of stewardship that demanded foresight rather than display. Florence listened, absorbed, and offered observations that surprised him, patterns she recognized from her father's habits, cautions about gaps that invited abuse. Edmund's hand stilled when she spoke, not from disagreement but from recognition, and Florence felt the unfamiliar pride of being useful without apology. As the morning wore on, messengers came and went, and Florence noted how Edmund's composure tightened whenever her name appeared in correspondence. He masked it expertly, but she saw the way his fingers paused, the fraction of a breath held before control resumed. It struck her then that his restraint was not absence of feeling but its careful management, and that caring for her had become a risk he calculated anew each hour. The thought warmed and frightened her in equal measure. She had survived by avoiding being wanted. Now she was learning how dangerous it was to be valued. After luncheon, Florence walked alone along the hedgerow, the peach gown bright against winter's brown, and considered the choice she had made. The Grange was safe, but safety had a cost: proximity, exposure, the slow deepening of attachment. She feared that if she allowed herself to lean, she would forget how to stand when the support was withdrawn. When Edmund joined her again, she spoke of it plainly, naming the fear without embellishment. He listened, then answered with quiet honesty. He did not intend to withdraw, he said, but he would not mistake protection for possession. She would be taught, not hidden. That evening, Florence dined with a clearer appetite and retired with a steadier mind. As she changed into a soft cream nightdress, she understood that the Grange had given her more than refuge. It had given her practice in competence, in candor, in standing within another's regard without dissolving. Whatever waited beyond the gates, she would meet it altered, and she sensed that Edmund, watching her learn to stand, was altered too. The messenger arrived just before noon, mud on his boots and urgency in his eyes, and Florence knew before Edmund broke the seal that London had refused to stay quiet. She sat at the breakfast table in a buttercream gown with deep green trim, her hands folded, her appetite gone, while Edmund read in silence that sharpened with each line. The missing Valehart ledger had surfaced again, not openly but as rumour hardened into plan. Viscount Rotherby intended to disperse or destroy it during a grand masquerade, where masks would excuse confusion and crowds would swallow proof. Florence felt the room narrow, the safety of the Grange thinning to a corridor of choices. To remain would be to watch truth vanish. To return would be to invite danger dressed as celebration. Edmund did not pretend the risk away. He named it cleanly, as he named everything. The masquerade was designed to confuse witnesses and fracture accountability. That meant urgency, not panic. He proposed a return to London under controlled conditions, routes altered, allies alerted, movements planned to the minute. Florence listened, fear rising and then settling into resolve. She had been carried far enough. "We go together," she said, not asking. Edmund's gaze lifted, measuring the steadiness of her voice, and he inclined his head once. Partnership, again, but this time under threat. Preparations moved with disciplined speed. Florence chose her attire with intention rather than ornament, laying aside anything that suggested retreat. She practiced her composure like a craft, steadying breath and posture, reminding herself that courage did not require absence of fear, only mastery of it. Edmund briefed her on the room's likely currents: who would cluster, who would watch, who would pretend indifference while counting exits. He did not overwhelm her with detail. He trusted her to absorb what mattered. That trust tightened something in her chest, equal parts gratitude and resolve. They departed the Grange at dusk, fields darkening to slate beneath a widening sky. Florence wore a warm ivory traveling dress beneath a dark teal cloak, practical and deliberate, her hair arranged for security rather than display. The road stretched long, and in the carriage Edmund spoke quietly of contingencies, of signals and separations, and what to do if the ledger slipped beyond reach. Florence asked precise questions, surprising herself with their calm. Fear, she discovered, became manageable when given work. As London's lights rose to meet them, Florence felt the old pulse of the city, hungry, brilliant, cruel, press against her composure. She did not flinch. She thought of the chapel shadow, the loosened bolt, the ledgers that taught her how truth hid. She thought of the Grange's order and the way Edmund had said he would teach, not hide. The masquerade would be a test of more than strategy. It would be a test of whether her name could survive being spoken in a room designed to consume it. When the carriage slowed near their destination, Edmund offered a final word, measured and exact. "We leave with evidence," he said, "or we leave having learned where it flees." Florence nodded, steady in her ivory dress, and understood that retreat was no longer a refuge. The night ahead glittered with danger and promise in equal measure, and she stepped into it not as a liability to be managed, but as a woman prepared to claim what had been taken. The masquerade opened its doors to London, with the practiced extravagance of a city that preferred danger disguised as delight. Florence entered on Edmund's arm beneath a spill of candlelight, her gown white and gold, the silk catching every flicker as if it had been woven for attention rather than concealment. A sunburst mask framed her eyes, delicate yet assertive. Anonymity turned into armor instead of erasure. Around her, feathers brushed shoulders, jewels winked like secrets, and laughter rose and fell in bright, careless waves. Florence felt the familiar tension coil in her chest, but it did not choke her this time. It sharpened her focus. She was no longer here to endure. She was here to retrieve truth before it could be scattered beyond recovery. Edmund wore black with austere elegance, his mask spare, his presence unmistakable even among the glittering excess. As they moved into the crowd, Florence noticed the detail he had chosen not to announce, a narrow Valehart blue ribbon hidden within the fold of his cravat, visible only when he turned his head a certain way. The sight struck her harder than any public declaration could have. It was intimate, deliberate, and dangerous in its quiet certainty. He had carried her name into a room built to destroy names, and done so without spectacle, as if the act required no defense. Florence steadied her breath and followed his lead, letting the rhythm of the music guide her steps while her eyes catalogued faces and movements with new precision. They navigated the floor as partners in more than dance, drifting where crowds thickened and thinning where watchers gathered, Edmund's hand light at her back, never guiding without consent. Florence answered masked inquiries with ease, her voice modulated, her laughter timed, her presence composed. She saw Viscount Rutherby at last near the edge of the ballroom, his charm deployed generously, his movements calculated rather than carefree. Lady Octavia Strathmere lingered nearby, her own mask elaborate, her posture relaxed in the way of someone who believed herself untouchable. Florence felt the old surge of anger stir, then settle into control. This was not the moment for confrontation. This was the moment for positioning. Edmund murmured strategy beneath the swell of violins, his words precise, economical. They would wait until Rutherby was surrounded by witnesses who could not later claim ignorance, until the ledger's location became unavoidable rather than debatable. Florence nodded, her gloved hand tightening briefly on Edmund's sleeve before releasing, the contact brief but grounding. Around them, the masquerade spun on, oblivious to the quiet recalibration taking place within its walls. As the music shifted and dancers changed partners, Florence felt a curious calm settle over her. Fear remained, but it no longer commanded her. She understood now that courage was not a performance. It was endurance shaped by intention. She glanced once more at the hidden blue ribbon, then lifted her chin and stepped deeper into the crowd. Tonight, masks would fall, willingly or not, and she intended to be standing when they did. They reached Rutherby when the room was loud enough to make secrecy impractical and crowded enough to make retreat conspicuous. Florence felt the press of bodies and silk, the warmth of candles, the faint rasp of breath behind masks, and understood why the masquerade had been chosen. Truth dissolved easily where anonymity thrived. She remained at Edmund's side, her white and gold gown bright beneath the chandeliers, her sunburst mask steady as if it were part of her face. Rutherby turned with an easy smile that faltered only a fraction when he recognized the Duke beside her. He bowed, all polished courtesy, and greeted Florence as if her presence were an amusing coincidence rather than a calculated risk. Edmund dispensed with pleasantries. His voice was low but carried, shaped to be overheard without becoming spectacle. He asked for the ledger, not as a challenge, as a matter of business long delayed. Rutherby laughed softly, spreading his hands in mock regret, suggesting that such rumors belonged to the past, that masquerades were no place for accusations. Lady Octavia drifted closer at once, her elaborate mask tilting as she took in the circle forming around them, curiosity sharpening like a blade drawn slowly. She remarked lightly on how tiresome old stories could be, how unfortunate it was when women mistook attention for importance. Florence felt the familiar sting rise, and then settle. She did not answer Octavia. She did not need to. Edmund shifted the field. He raised his voice just enough for nearby listeners to catch, for dancers to slow, for attention to tilt. He repeated the request, naming the ledger openly, connecting it to the Valehart inquiry now known to be under formal review. The effect was immediate. Laughter thinned, faces turned. Octavia's smile tightened into calculation. Rutherby attempted retreat through charm, insisting that nothing of the sort existed, that Edmund must be misinformed. Edmund did not argue. He stated that refusal would be noted, that witnesses were present, and that obstruction carried consequences beyond embarrassment. Florence felt the weight of the room settle on her shoulders, felt the old instinct to disappear stir, and refused it. She spoke then, her voice calm, precise, unadorned by appeal. She named dates, named offices, named the solicitor whose hand had moved the ledger from custody to concealment. She did not accuse, she asserted. The facts landed with quiet force. Rutherby's smile faltered. Octavia's eyes flashed, then cooled. The masquerade's music continued, but the circle around them had tightened into something attentive and sharp, Rutherby yielded with performative reluctance, producing the ledger through an intermediary, as if conceding a trivial point. Florence accepted it with gloved hands that did not tremble, the worn cover heavier than its size suggested. Relief flared and dimmed. She flipped the pages quickly, trained now to read absence as clearly as ink. Sections were missing, deliberately torn. Tucked within was a sealed note, its language careful, its implication chilling. The true architect of the Valehart ruin had been protected by proximity and prettiness, not by proof. Octavia leaned close enough for Florence to smell her perfume and murmured a warning disguised as sympathy. Florence met her gaze through the mask and said nothing. She did not need to. Edmund placed himself beside Florence, his stillness unmistakable, and announced that the inquiry would proceed with what had been recovered, and that missing pages left trails no one outran forever. The circle loosened, murmurs spreading outward like ripples. As they withdrew, Florence felt triumph tempered by resolve. The ledger was not whole, but it was enough to change the direction of the hunt. The masquerade resumed around them, bright and careless, but Florence carried the weight of truth against her ribs and knew the night had shifted. Masks had not protected everyone. Some had simply delayed the reckoning. They did not linger after the ledger was secured. Edmund guided Florence through a side passage and into a quieter antechamber where the music dulled to a distant thrum, and only then did Florence allow herself to breathe fully. The white and gold gown felt suddenly heavier, the silk warm from her pulse, as if the night itself pressed close to hear what she would do next. She opened the ledger again beneath a sconce's steadier light, scanning margins and bindings with the discipline Edmund had taught her. The missing sections were unmistakable, clean tears, measured removals, the work of someone who knew exactly which truths could not survive daylight. The sealed note lay in her palm like a dare. She did not open it at once. She met Edmund's gaze instead, and in the calm there, she found permission to proceed without fear. The note's language was spare and careful, designed to reveal without confessing. It named no culprit outright, but it traced proximity, whose counsel had guided the court, whose drawing rooms had soothed outrage, whose smiles had softened suspicion at precisely the right hours. The handwriting suggested habit rather than haste, confidence rather than panic. Florence felt a sharp clarity settle over her, the kind that follows grief when denial finally releases its grip. The truth was not a single villain, but a network made polite by charm and protected by habit. Her father had refused to participate in that network, and for that refusal he had been crushed. They changed quickly into traveling cloaks, Florence in a black silk evening cloak worn as armor, Edmund in dark wool that absorbed light, and departed through a service entrance where lanterns threw long, watchful shadows. Outside, the air was cold and bracing, the city humming as if nothing consequential had occurred. In the carriage, Florence held the ledger against her ribs and felt the ache of it, vindication close enough to wound, justice near enough to hurt. Edmund spoke softly, mapping the next steps with precision, the solicitor to be confronted, the witnesses to be assembled, the inquiry to be pressed while the ledger's existence could not be denied. He did not offer consolation he could not guarantee. He offered action. As the carriage rolled, Florence changed within the privacy of shadows, removing the masquerade's finery and donning a plain black gown beneath her cloak, the simplicity grounding her. She considered the cost of the night, the exposure, the danger, the knowledge that the enemy had not been routed but provoked. Fear flickered and was mastered. She had crossed a line from endurance to engagement. The past had tried to scatter itself in a room of masks, and she had gathered enough of it to make running impossible. They reached Calderwyn House near dawn. Florence watched the city recede in the window's reflection and felt a steadiness she did not recognize as her own until she named it. The ledger was incomplete, yes, but incompletion left edges, and edges cut. Missing pages meant fingerprints. Protected names meant leverage. As Edmund helped her down from the carriage, his hand firm and exact, Florence understood that hope had returned to her not as a fragile wish but as a tool. The night had not finished the work. It had only given it direction, and she was ready to follow it through. Octavia Strathmere did not wait for daylight to counterattack. By mid-morning, London had already been fed a version of events carefully shaped to bruise, without naming a blow. Florence read the circulating letter in the breakfast room at Calderwyn House, the paper trembling only once between her fingers before she mastered it. The forgery was clever, phrases lifted from overheard conversations, dates nudged just enough to suggest design, sentiments twisted into implication, portraying Florence as an ambitious interloper who had ensnared the Duke through calculated distress. It did not accuse Edmund outright. It invited society to conclude for itself. Florence wore a plain black gown with a white fichu, the severity chosen deliberately, not mourning but armor, and as the dowager read over her shoulder, Florence felt the old sting of recognition. London preferred its cruelty plausible. Invitations evaporated with elegant speed. A calling card returned unopened carried more weight than any shouted insult. Florence sensed the pressure recalibrate around her, the same machine that had once crushed her father turning its cogs again. For a moment, doubt pricked. Had she dragged Edmund into ruin by daring to stand? The thought did not last. It burned away, replaced by a colder anger that steadied her spine. She would not apologize for existing, and she would not allow lies to become architecture. Edmund responded without theatrics. He read the letter once, then folded it with surgical calm and summoned his solicitor. He did not reassure Florence with promises he could not keep. He outlined steps: authentication of handwriting, tracing distribution, identifying the first hands that carried the forgery into circulation. He ordered invitations for that evening, not to flatter, but to confront. Those whose influence shaped rumor would be made to witness consequence. Florence listened, heart steadying with each precise instruction, and asked questions that sharpened the plan rather than slowing it. Edmund met them without condescension. Partnership had become habit. When Florence ventured out that afternoon, she did so openly, walking the square in her black gown, bonnet trimmed only with restraint. She did not hurry. She did not hide. Whispers followed like a low wind, and she let them pass without offering shelter. A matron's eyes flicked away. A gentleman hesitated, then bowed. The smallest shifts mattered. Visibility, Edmund had said, could be shaped. By evening, Calderwyn House filled with guests who understood they were attending something other than a dinner. Florence changed into a deep burgundy silk gown with subtle gold embroidery, the color rich without pleading, and stood beside Edmund as he addressed the room. He announced a formal inquiry into the Valehart matter, sponsored under his name, naming recovered evidence and missing pages, inviting scrutiny rather than rumor. The effect was immediate and uneven: admiration, outrage, calculation, but unmistakable. Florence felt gratitude so sharp it ached, not because he spoke for her, but because he refused to let others speak over her. As the gathering broke, Florence realized something had shifted irrevocably. The lie had not been defeated, but it had been challenged in the open. Octavia's strike had drawn blood, yes, but it had also revealed fear. And fear, Florence knew now, was the surest sign they were close. The invitations Edmund issued carried the quiet authority of inevitability, and by dusk Calderwyn House was filled with the particular tension that gathered when people sensed they were being summoned to witness consequence. Florence prepared with deliberate calm, choosing a deep burgundy silk gown with fine gold embroidery at the cuffs and neckline, the color signaling resolve rather than defiance. She fastened her gloves slowly, grounding herself in the ritual, and reminded herself that this evening was not about vindication alone. It was about forcing the truth into rooms that had long preferred shadow. When she entered the drawing room on Edmund's arm, conversation faltered, then resumed at a careful pitch, as if London were testing the weight of its own voice. Edmund did not allow the gathering to drift. He waited until tea had been served, and the room had settled into its most attentive hush, then addressed his guests with calm precision. He spoke of the Valehart inquiry without embellishment, naming recovered evidence, missing pages, and the necessity of formal review. He framed the matter not as a personal grievance but as a civic obligation, a question of whether the Tun intended to value comfort over correctness. Florence stood beside him, hands steady, feeling the attention tilt toward her, not as spectacle but as subject. She did not speak yet. She did not need to. Edmund's insistence on procedure, on witnesses and records and accountability, altered the room's balance more effectively than any impassioned plea could have. Reactions rippled outward in subtle waves. A matron nodded, calculating alliances. A gentleman frowned, recognizing risk. Someone laughed too quickly and then fell silent when no one joined in. Florence met each gaze with composure, refusing to supply emotion on demand. When Edmund invited questions, a few cautious inquiries surfaced, shaped to test rather than challenge. He answered each with clarity, and when Florence added a detail, dates written in text, signatures that betrayed pressure, she did so with quiet authority. The room adjusted again. This was not rumor being rebutted. It was fact being assembled. The Dowager Duchess Honoria observed from her chair with narrowed eyes, weighing cost against principle. When she spoke, it was to underscore propriety, not to undermine the inquiry. She reminded the room that justice delayed corrodes trust, and that families were built not merely on inheritance but on responsibility. The endorsement was measured, but its impact was unmistakable. Florence felt a tremor of relief she did not indulge. Approval was welcome, dependence was not. As the evening drew to a close, guests departed with expressions ranging from thoughtful to unsettled. The house exhaled. Florence retreated briefly to the window, the burgundy silk warm against her palms, and allowed herself a moment to acknowledge the weight of what had occurred. Edmund joined her without comment. "This will provoke response," he said quietly. Florence nodded. "It already has," she replied, thinking of Octavia's forged letter and the speed with which lies traveled. When the last carriage rolled away, Florence understood that the battle had crossed a line no one could pretend not to see. The inquiry now bore the Calderwyn name publicly, and with it, the expectation of outcome. She felt fear, yes, but it was edged with purpose. She had not been shielded tonight. She had been positioned, and in that positioning, she recognized the shape of her own power beginning to hold. The Dowager Duchess Honoria Calderwyn requested Florence's company the following afternoon, her message delivered with the same measured politeness that masked intention. Florence entered the smaller sitting room in a soft ivory gown with pale rose ribbons, the fabric light against her skin, her posture steady despite the quiet unease that gathered whenever Honoria wished to speak alone. The Dowager dismissed the maid and gestured for Florence to sit, her own hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes sharp but no longer dismissive. What followed was not interrogation, but disclosure, offered with the restraint of someone unaccustomed to confession. Honoria spoke of Edmund's father, a man remembered publicly for his composure and privately for his suspicions. Years before, he had sensed corruption moving easily through respectable circles, money and favors exchanged behind smiles, records adjusted with quiet confidence. When he pressed too firmly, doors closed. Invitations cooled. Warnings arrived, disguised as concern. Edmund had been young enough to observe, old enough to understand, and he had learned the lesson thoroughly. Affection invited leverage. Loyalty created targets. Love, in such a world, was not merely dangerous, it was exploitable. Honoria's voice did not soften when she admitted that Edmund's restraint had been shaped by fear, not indifference, and that he had sworn never to give society a weapon forged from his own heart. Florence listened without interruption, compassion blooming where insecurity once lived. The revelation settled into place with unsettling clarity. Edmund's distance, his control, his careful avoidance of vulnerability, all of it aligned with the man she had come to know. He did not withhold warmth because he lacked it. He withheld it because he understood its cost. When Honoria finished, she did not ask for Florence's gratitude or compliance. She asked only whether Florence understood the risk Edmund was taking now. Florence answered honestly. She did, and she would not waste it. Later, Florence found Edmund alone in the library, the late light gilding the spines of books he pretended to read. She did not recount Honoria's words in detail. She did not press him for assurances. She told him simply that she understood his caution better than she had before, and that she would never turn his restraint into accusation or his loyalty into leverage. The admission cost her, because it required offering safety without demanding anything in return. Edmund looked at her then, really looked, and something in his composure eased, just enough to be felt. He did not speak at once. When he did, it was only to say that understanding was rarer than affection, and therefore more valuable. That evening, Florence walked the gallery alone, the ivory of her gown pale against dark wood, and considered the quiet shift taking place between them. Protection had become reciprocal. She no longer felt like a cause Edmund defended out of principle alone. She felt like a person he trusted not to wound him where others had. The knowledge was heavy and tender in equal measure. Love had not been named, not yet, but something deeper had been laid between them, an agreement of care that did not require spectacle. Florence understood then that courage did not always look like standing tall before enemies. Sometimes it looked like being gentle with a man who had learned to survive by being hard. Florence discovered the missing pages not by accident, but by attention sharpened through weeks of being underestimated. The clue appeared as a flourish at the end of a copied line, an abbreviated mark she had seen before, used by a solicitor who valued discretion above honesty. It surfaced while she reviewed correspondence in the afternoon light, dressed in a sapphire blue gown with a crisp white collar, her sleeves neat, her posture composed. The realization arrived without drama, a quiet alignment of detail and memory, and with it came the certainty that the pages had not vanished at random. They had been shepherded, protected, and concealed by someone accustomed to moving truth without leaving fingerprints. Florence brought the matter to Edmund at once, laying out the reasoning with methodical calm. The solicitor in question had served Octavia's family interests for years, appearing at precisely the moments when confusion became convenient. Florence proposed confrontation not in shadow but in daylight, with witnesses chosen for integrity rather than influence. She would not be cornered again in rooms designed to swallow words. Edmund listened without interruption, his expression unreadable until she finished. Then he asked questions, not to test her resolve, but to refine the plan. Who should attend? What documents must be present? How the exchange could be made unavoidable without tipping into spectacle? When he finally nodded, it was in acceptance of her leadership. "You will set the terms," he said simply. The trust in those words settled into her bones. Arrangements were made with care. Invitations were framed as routine consultation. Witnesses were chosen for their reputations rather than their reach. Florence dressed with intention, the sapphire blue chosen to signal authority without aggression, her gloves navy, her hair arranged with unadorned precision. When the solicitor arrived, he brought courtesy and condescension in equal measure, mistaking Florence's composure for pliability. She greeted him politely, offered tea, and then began naming dates, referencing the ledger's movement, asking questions whose answers could be verified. He attempted dismissal, then diversion, then charm. Florence held steady. She did not accuse. She required explanation. The shift came when she placed a copy of the ledger on the table and asked him to account for the missing sections in the presence of witnesses. Silence stretched. The solicitor's confidence thinned, his hand hovering above the cup he did not lift. Edmund remained still at Florence's side, his restraint lending gravity without stealing focus. When the solicitor finally spoke, it was to offer partial truth, then fuller, the narrative unraveling under the weight of documentation and daylight. The missing pages had been removed and held for safekeeping, a phrase that curdled as it was spoken. Florence listened without interruption, absorbing vindication and grief in equal measure. When the pages were produced at last, her hands did not tremble. She accepted them, thanked the witnesses, and concluded the meeting with measured finality. As the door closed behind the solicitor, Florence exhaled, the breath long and steady. She had not been rescued. She had acted, and the truth had answered. The truth arrived without triumph, born in ink and signatures that could not apologize for the years they had consumed. Florence sat at the long table in Edmund's study, the recovered pages laid out in careful order, their edges worn where hands had hidden them and time had tried to erase their meaning. She wore the same sapphire blue gown, the color steadying her as she read, because changing would have felt like evasion. The documents were precise and merciless. They traced a narrow corridor through the past, naming transactions that never should have occurred, instructions given in careful phrases, and the quiet pressure applied to a man who refused to become convenient. Her father's refusal was there, unmistakable in the margin notes that recorded his dissent without acknowledging its cost. He had been asked to sign a lie to preserve comfort for others. He had declined. The ledger recorded what followed. Florence felt the room recede as understanding settled into place. Vindication did not arrive like sunlight. It arrived like a blade, sharp and necessary, cutting away the last refuge of doubt while opening old wounds to the air. The pages proved her father's integrity with devastating clarity, yet they could not restore her mother's laughter or return the years Florence had spent moving through rooms as if already condemned. She closed her eyes for a moment and allowed grief to surface, not theatrically, not for witnesses, but as a private reckoning with what truth could and could not repair. Edmund stood near the window, giving her space without leaving her alone. When she looked up, he met her gaze with a steadiness that invited neither collapse nor performance. She rose and crossed to him, the papers held against her ribs, and spoke the words she had carried for so long. Her father had not failed. The world had. Edmund listened, then placed his hand over hers, firm and exact, a touch that acknowledged loss without attempting to diminish it. The contact grounded her, anchoring sorrow to something present and real. They reviewed the evidence together, naming the architect of the ruin at last, not a faceless rumor, but a man shielded by proximity and prettiness, whose influence had softened outrage and redirected blame with practiced ease. The solicitor's confession, the missing pages, the corroborating entries all aligned into a narrative no court could easily dismiss. Edmund outlined the next steps with careful precision: formal submission to the inquiry, notification of relevant offices, protection for witnesses who had found courage too late, but not too late to matter. Florence asked questions, not because she doubted, but because she needed to understand how justice would move now that it had been awakened. When the work was done, the study fell quiet. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the moment's gravity. Florence stood at the window beside Edmund, the sapphire of her gown catching the late light, and felt a strange, bracing pride settle beneath the sorrow. Her name had been dragged through rooms and columns and smiles, and it had survived long enough to be spoken plainly at last. Vindication had come with grief, yes, but also with a fierce clarity about who she was and what she would no longer accept. As Edmund escorted her from the study, Florence understood that the battle had crossed its final threshold. The truth was no longer vulnerable to dismissal. It was documented, witnessed, and ready to be named in rooms that mattered. She carried the papers not as a relic of pain, but as proof of endurance. Whatever followed, judgment, apology, or reluctant acknowledgement, she would meet it upright. The ledger had been restored, and with it, the right to stand without flinching when her name was spoken. Octavia Strathmere moved swiftly once concealment failed, deploying the oldest refuge society reliably offered its threatened daughters, marriage arranged with unseemly haste and draped in the language of romance. The announcement arrived before breakfast, delivered as cheerful intelligence meant to drown inquiry in congratulation. Florence read it in the small morning room, dressed in a soft pale stone, morning gown trimmed with white, and felt no surprise, only a cool recognition of strategy. Viscount Rotherby would provide the title, Octavia would provide charm. Together they would depart England before questions finished sharpening. The plan was tidy, plausible, and insulting in its confidence. Edmund did not permit tidiness. He received the notice with a stillness that suggested calculation already complete and summoned his solicitor without delay. The marriage license, he said, would not proceed under a cloud of unresolved fraud, and he outlined the lever that made speed unnecessary. Ecclesiastical scrutiny invited by evidence already submitted. Licenses granted in haste could be revoked with equal ceremony if issued under false pretenses, and Edmund intended to ensure that every official involved understood the reputational cost of facilitating escape. Florence listened, the steadiness of his tone, a counterweight to the familiar surge of dread. This was not vengeance, it was restraint applied where it belonged. When word reached Octavia that obstacles had been placed deliberately in her path, her response was predictable. Letters arrived laced with indignation, warning of impropriety, accusing Edmund of cruelty, attempting to recast accountability as persecution. Florence read one such missive without flinching, the ink's fury revealing fear more clearly than confession could. She answered none of it. Silence, she had learned, could be weaponized when chosen rather than endured. Edmund ensured that replies came instead from offices that mattered, each noting the inquiry's progress and the inadvisability of flight. Society adjusted with the subtlety of a turning tide. Conversations cooled when Octavia's name surfaced. Invitations hesitated. Smiles acquired caution. Florence walked the square that afternoon in a simple navy walking dress with white gloves, her posture composed, and felt eyes measuring a new equation. She was no longer the convenient subject of old stories. She was attached to process, to documentation, to consequence. Edmund did not hover, but he remained visible enough that assumptions corrected themselves. That evening, as dusk settled and lamps were lit, Florence joined Edmund in the library to review the day's correspondence. She asked, quietly, whether he feared retaliation. Edmund considered before answering. He feared complacency more than reprisal, he said. Complacency was how injustice survived. The candor steadied her. She realized that his courage did not depend on anger but on patience, a willingness to endure discomfort longer than those who relied on intimidation. By nightfall, Octavia's planned departure had stalled into uncertainty. The wedding that promised escape had become a spotlight, drawing attention rather than deflecting it. Florence changed into a soft ivory evening gown, sat by the fire, and allowed herself a small breath of relief she did not mistake for victory. Justice, she knew now, advanced by increments, not declarations. But the line had been held, escape had been denied. And in that denial, Florence felt the balance shift again, not toward safety yet, but toward accountability that could no longer be shrugged aside. The inquiry convened beneath a ceiling that had witnessed generations of careful speech and calculated silence, and Florence felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders the moment she entered. She wore a soft ivory gown with a Valehart blue sash, the color chosen not for defiance but for clarity, her gloves immaculate, her posture exact. Edmund stood behind her rather than beside her, a deliberate choice that placed her at the center without propping her there. The room was crowded with officials, solicitors, and observers whose attention carried consequence. The air held the faint rasp of parchment and restraint. Florence breathed once and began. She spoke without flourish, presenting the facts as they existed now, rather than as they had been misused before. Dates written in text, signatures that bent under pressure. The ledger's path from custody to concealment. The recovered pages were submitted, their edges worn by secrecy, their contents precise. Florence did not perform grief. She named it and moved on, refusing to let pain become a substitute for proof. Questions followed, measured and cautious, and she answered them with the discipline she had learned at her father's table, where accuracy mattered more than comfort. The room listened differently as her voice held steady. Rumor had no foothold where documentation stood. Octavia Strathmere observed with polished composure that failed to mask the tightness at her eyes. When insinuation was attempted, when Edmund's involvement was framed as undue influence, Edmund answered once, calmly, asserting that evidence invited scrutiny regardless of who presented it. The distinction mattered. Florence felt it land. When her testimony concluded, the inquiry did not erupt into drama. It moved forward, methodical and unavoidable. Notices were issued, further examinations scheduled. The machinery of justice, slow and imperfect, engaged at last. As Florence stepped back, her pulse thudded, but her hands did not tremble. She had stood in the open and spoken her name without apology. Outside, the sound of the city returned, carriages, voices, life continuing. Edmund offered his arm only after the doors closed behind them, his touch steady and exact. Florence accepted, aware of a quiet truth. The world had heard her not as a cautionary tale, but as a witness. The shift was subtle, but it was real, and it would not be undone. Octavia made her final attempt where society felt safest, by turning devotion itself into the charge. The room reconvened in quieter formation, the inquiry's corridors humming with speculation disguised as courtesy, when she suggested, with careful regret, that Duke Calderwyn's judgment had been compromised. She spoke of influence rather than evidence, of fascination mistaken for principle, of how easily a clever woman might persuade a man unused to attachment. The words were chosen to invite laughter, to reduce truth to romance and romance to folly. Florence felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old danger of being recast as manipulation rather than wronged party, and she held herself still, refusing to shrink into the role Octavia offered. Edmund answered before the murmurs could settle. His voice carried without effort, not raised, not theatrical, and the effect was immediate. He stated that affection was not enchantment, and integrity was not obsession, and that he had chosen to support the Valehart inquiry because injustice, left unchallenged, became precedent. He did not name love. He named choice. The distinction cut cleanly through the room, robbing the insinuation of oxygen. Laughter died unclaimed. Octavia's composure thinned. Later, in the quiet of a side corridor, Florence confronted Edmund with the fear she had not yet spoken aloud. She wore her ivory gown and blue sash-like armor that had begun to feel heavy, and she asked why he was willing to endure suspicion for her sake. Edmund did not offer gallantry. He told her the truth with controlled honesty, that he could tolerate attack more easily than he could tolerate watching her bear shame that was never hers. The admission was not dramatic, but it landed with weight. Florence felt the word love hover between them, unspoken and dangerous, and understood that restraint did not mean absence. It meant waiting for the moment when truth could survive being named. They parted without touch, without promise, yet something irrevocable had shifted. The world had tried to turn their alignment into scandal and failed. Florence realized then that whatever came next would not be dictated by rumor. It would be chosen, deliberately, by them both. The verdict arrived without ceremony, delivered in careful language that nonetheless rang like a bell through Florence's chest. The Valehart disgrace was formally overturned, the accusations corrected in public record, and notices prepared for the very papers that had once sharpened her shame into sport. Florence stood in her ivory gown with the blue sash, hands steady as her name was spoken aloud without disdain. Outside, voices gathered, curious rather than cruel, and she felt tears rise, not weakness, but release. Edmund guided her away with quiet care, his presence steady, and for the first time, Florence understood what freedom sounded like when it spoke her name. In the quiet that followed vindication, fear returned in a subtler form. Florence stood by the window in a soft blush evening gown, wondering whether courage borrowed could endure once protection stepped aside. She told Edmund the truth she had hidden, that she could not survive on another's banner alone, no matter how noble. Edmund listened, then confessed. His own restraint had always been fear of loss, not lack of feeling. Loving her would give the world a weapon, yet losing her would cost more. They did not rush the moment. They chose it, carefully, knowing love, like truth, must be carried openly, or not at all. Spring announced itself at Calderwyn Grange with a gentler confidence than London ever allowed, light softening stone and hedge alike, as if the world itself wished to be kinder this time. Edmund chose that moment deliberately. The fete he hosted was public enough to be undeniable, inviting tenants, patrons, matrons, and observers who would carry what they saw back into drawing rooms and papers alike. Florence arrived in a blush rose gown with white long gloves, her hair arranged simply, her expression clear-eyed rather than cautious, because she was no longer bracing for judgment. She was ready to be seen. Edmund addressed the gathering without flourish. He spoke of responsibility, of names used as weapons and of the harm done when power protected comfort instead of truth. Then he unveiled the foundation he had established, dedicated to restoring those ruined by false accusation and quiet cruelty. At its center was the crest, newly struck and unmistakable, bearing Valehart beside Calderwyn, equal in weight and meaning. A murmur moved through the crowd, not scandalized this time, but acknowledging. Florence felt her breath catch, not because she was being rescued, but because her name had been lifted and set where it could shelter others. Later, away from the press of witnesses but still within the truth he had declared, Edmund took Florence's hands. He did not speak of salvation. He spoke of partnership, of choosing each other with eyes open, of carrying names together rather than hiding behind them. He asked for her life beside his, not as protection, but as shared purpose. Florence answered with steady joy, knowing exactly who she was when she said yes. When applause rose again, it did not sound like triumph. It sounded like acknowledgement. Florence stood beneath spring light, her name no longer a liability, but a banner raised by choice, and understood that love, like truth, endured because it was finally allowed to stand in the open.